Just to clarify, I'm Avian Da, speaking for California Debate Institute, and we are the first speaker in our talk. Is anyone not ready? Cool. Start the time now. Sanjay and I negate. The U.S. should not increase its diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia. Our sole contention concerns Middle Eastern relations. In recent years, American relations with the Middle East, a region most academics agree is synonymous with West Asia, have worsened. Professor Rubin of Yale University explains, Biden's mantra might be diplomacy is back, but throwing allies under the bus has become his main doctrine. Due to Biden's short-sighted attacks and his unwillingness to honestly assess the Iran nuclear deal or take the Saudi strategy concerns seriously, have fully detrimented the U.S.-Middle Eastern relations. He concludes that the trust Biden lost with Saudi Arabia, first under the Obama administration and now with his own administration, will take decades to rebuild at best. After cutting ties with the U.S., Middle Eastern countries have now turned to China to mediate conflicts. Middle Eastern policy expert Jesse Marks explains, China is a new player in the Middle East with its novel approach towards conflict, emphasizing non-interference. Furthering that from Sudan to Syria, China has learned to apply this creative involvement to secure its desired outcomes. Hubbard of the New York Times writes that Beijing has welcomed its influence and Arab leaders appreciate that China, under this virtue of non-interference, won't get involved in their domestic policies. In fact, this is the exact opposite of the American approach. Regan of the U.S. Institute for Peace confirms that a focal point of U.S. diplomatic policy is to increase their influence and control the country's internal political processes, which have directly correlated and led to a sharp increase in violent protests. Moreover, Stevenson finds that U.S. diplomacy strategy also consists of military bases in host nations, something Dr. Thrall finds was the #1 motivation for homegrown terrorist attacks, with the number of terrorist attacks skyrocketing by 1,900% in countries that the U.S. conducts military strikes in. Thus, it's no surprise that with the decrease of U.S. involvement in the Middle East, the Global Peace Index finds that the epicenter of terrorism has moved out of the Middle East, declining globally by 82% and reaching its lowest level in history. Now, Hubbard concludes that with Middle Eastern nations looking for others to fill in the mediation vacuum the U.S. leaves behind, many governments have now turned to Beijing. Importantly, China is uniquely positioned to best mediate Middle Eastern conflicts. Jevons in 2022 finds that China started a diplomatic drive to promote its plans to end the enduring conflicts in the Middle East, furthering that China wants to play a role in this region to promote security, development, and governance. Historically, he finds that this was the case with the civil war in South Sudan in 2013, where Chinese negotiators were crucial in securing ceasefire. Holistically, Davis in 2022 finds that conflict-related fatalities in the Middle East and North Africa region fell for the 4th consecutive year, down 75%. As for the U.S.'s future role in the Middle East, political scientist Hamovitz explains that Washington's dominance in the Middle East is now being challenged in irreversible ways due to the zero-sum nature of political power. He finds that China's rising role in the region necessitates that it stays involved to mediate geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East, concluding that there is little choice for the U.S. but to find new ways to establish dominance outside of the Middle East. Indeed, the U.S. re-engaging diplomatically is a recipe for conflict and disaster. Beyond directly increasing terrorism within the Middle East, Professor Marwan Bashara explains that Washington insists on engaging with the Middle Eastern-China relationship, it is sure to create new geopolitical tensions. He furthers that historically, a rising power like China and a dominant power like the U.S. are bound for costly conflict, and that accommodating China's rise and integrating it within the U.S. geopolitical strategy is far better than collusion and confrontation. As such, U.S. diplomatic re-engagement within West Asia or the Middle East will promote Middle Eastern conflict by disengaging China, increasing terrorism through the failed U.S. diplomatic energy, and ultimately risk great power conflict with China. Thus, Sanjay and I are proud to negate. Thank you.
Can I just see the 75% here under South Sudan?
Yeah, and can I also see that there would be new ways for the U.S. to be involved? Or sorry, actually, never mind, not that one. It's the one where it says you're like integrating within the strategy. It's the card, either it's part of it, or it's the one after you say, if U.S. engages China, it creates tensions. It's the one that says like, instead of collusion or like confrontation, we need to integrate within our strategy or something.
Okay.
Yeah. And then other than that, I'll be right.
How much battery do you have there?
I'm fine. I think there's some up there. That's fine. Right, is everyone ready?
Yeah, I just sent the second part. So I just
We can do it.
I grab a charger?
Yeah.
Sure.
Can I grab a charger? Sorry.
No, no problem. You came at a perfect time.
Not the portable one, last one.
Sorry, can I also see trade-off evidence that U.S. diplomatically engaging disengages China? Thank you. And I'm not problem.
Yeah.
Let me just plug in the portable one. I'm so sorry, guys. Did not expect to be debating double and triple lactose. Alright, is that all the evidence you wanted to get?
They're
Oh,
sending,
they're still sending
they're
it?
sending
Okay.
one
Oh
more.
yeah, we just sent it, as
Okay.
soon as you get it, we can.
Again, I'm really sorry. Alright, let's go. Alright, is everyone ready?
You're good, yeah.
Okay.
Wait, sorry, what's the tag of the last one you sent?
It's basically, how is this?
Or did you send? Or yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna start. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait.
You good?
Yeah, we're
Okay.
good. Yeah.
Alright. Everyone ready?
Yeah.
Alright. Our first contention is preventing an Iraqi civil war. Iraq is about to enter a civil war. Hussein 22 writes that a stalemate between Shiites and Tehran seems to be leading the country towards civil war. Iraq is about to plunge into a civil war that could spill beyond its borders. Luckily, the US can uniquely resolve tensions between the rival factions as they do not support either side. Wahab 22 finds that US officials may be able to affect Iraq's behavior by leveraging its need for international legitimacy. Washington should support proposals to host rival Shia factions for dialogue, a post that can play a potent moderating role in Baghdad. Indeed, FAF 22 confirms that by engaging a wide range of Iraq's subgroups, the US can find a way ahead and increase the value of cooperation for all sides. This is critical now, as TNN 22 corroborates that Iraq faces dangerous levels of instability and is entering a particularly dangerous phase, which only diplomacy can solve. Unfortunately, absent this diplomacy, civil war is inevitable, as Twige 22 finds that Iraq is nearing the brink of a Shiite civil war. The increasingly violent rivalry of polarized political wings could dissolve into all-out internal warfare given the heavily armed population, and civil war would spill over. Ferguson 06 finds that the civil war in Iraq has the potential to spill over into neighboring countries like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. And Brown 22 finds that in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and Pakistan, 387,000 civilians have died a violent death as a result of these wars. Our second contention is ending Syrian drug trafficking. Captagon production facilities run by the government exist in Syria. Martin 22 finds that the task of the 4th Division is to secure the Syrian regime, but Captagon production facilities, a type of amphetamine, are under the control and protection of the 4th Division. The Syrian president, military, and political elites, who are looking for extra cash amid the difficult economic situation, are also taking part in the production and smuggling of this drug. The US needs to pass the Captagon Act and take the lead on diplomacy. Net 22 finds that the Captagon Act would be an important first step to a broader international response, which will not happen without leadership from Washington. Europe is not going to take the first step on combating Syrian drug trafficking unless the US is keen to do so. There are a lot of opportunities for the United States to serve as a force multiplier in the region. Because of our knowledge of the banking system, surveillance, marine and overland traffic, and our work with law enforcement partners through Interpol with the prime objective of cutting off funding that's backing Assad's regime. US diplomacy would solve for the Syrian drug crisis, as Digress 21 finds that US officials possess a wealth of actionable information concerning Syrian narco-trafficking. A name and shame campaign can bring overdue attention to Syria's Captagon industry. Public disclosures can also reduce the pressure on key informants within the country who are currently reluctant to come forward with invaluable data out of fear of reprisal. Such information is vital to much-needed research on the drug trade and can support better enforcement outcomes. Again, this is all if the United States increases diplomacy and passes the Captagon Act. This is important because Captagon is crucial to the economy of the Syrian government, who is currently oppressing civilians and fighting in the Syrian civil war. Cutting off trade would stop the war. Net 22 continues that the true scale of the trade could be as high as $30 billion. This is 45 times the scale of Syria's entire legal export industry. There is literally no other part of the Syrian economy that matters now other than Captagon. The rapid expansion and links to the Assad regime have directly affected Washington's regional interests. Captagon is fueling terrorism in Syria, and we want to cut off that money now, said one congresswoman. The best way to stop this is to cut off the head of the snake now. And the Syrian war has already claimed over 300,000 lives, affirming takes funding away from Assad, paralyzing the Syrian war effort, and ending the war. UN 22 finds that 300,000 civilians have already been killed between 2011 and 2021 in Syria due to the conflict. This could double if we spend another decade in Syria. Vote out. Thank you.
Right.
You ready for cross?
Wait, Daniel.
Yes.
Before, can you get it?
No, I didn't make it cross.
Okay.
Yes.
Before cross, we're gonna run a little bit of prep time.
Alright. Yeah, well, I think
3 seconds.
Sure. Alright, maybe. Alright, I'm ready whenever you are.
5 foot, yeah. Is it 5 first question?
Yeah, of course.
Alright.
You want to stand up here?
Yeah, no worries.
No worries.
Alright, cool. So let's talk about your Iraq argument.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So you're telling me that Iraq, like how the U.S. diplomacy can help Iraq, right?
Correct.
I'm just a bit confused why Iraq, the Iraqi government, and the Iraqi civilians will trust the U.S. when the U.S. has invaded Iraq in the past and tortured the innocents of Iraqi civilians.
Well, didn't you say that specifically that Biden's strategy is bad because the United States is currently pulling out militarily?
Well, no, I'm just saying in the past, when the U.S. has hurt Iraq, why would Iraq just suddenly trust if you affirm?
Because there's not
Because
only
on
one,
the-
may I respond,
Yeah,
please?
for sure.
Okay,
Sorry.
there's not only one faction or group of Iraq, right?
Okay.
So if you're saying that the U.S. invaded in before, that was when Iraq was under the control of Saddam Hussein, correct?
Okay.
So not everyone in the country supported Saddam Hussein. For example, the Kurds, who he basically genocided, right, for example, would not support Saddam Hussein and probably would support the United States. So Iraq as a monolith wouldn't just dislike the United States because they invaded. You need to provide more warranting of why specifically the Iraqi populace would not like the United States. Because I could say that, yeah, the Iraqi populace would not dislike the United States because they relieved them of, a despotic dictator, Saddam Hussein. We can have, Okay, so on your first contention about relations, right? So you say China is non-interfering. So if they're non-interfering, how can they actually solve conflicts if they don't actually participate in the structure?
So there's a key distinction between so basically what we tell you is that the US has an interference strategy where they interfere in the country's political processes. We're saying that China does not have this form of interference strategy. Rather, they do conflict mediation, which is what we saw in Sudan, Syria, which was able to negotiate for the 2013 Sudan civil war. Right?
May I ask a follow-up question real quick?
Sure.
Yeah, so isn't the United Nations non-interventionist as well? Aren't they a purely non-interventionist actor?
I guess, but
Okay,
I'm not
so
sure.
why is the UN, for example, not able to solve these issues?
I mean, we would probably say that the UN constitutes multiple countries, and it's not necessarily a direct.
Exactly, it's pure
not,
non-intervention.
Well, no, because it's not a direct form of diplomacy. What we're arguing through China does. Can I get a question now?
Okay, yeah, sure.
So let's talk about this Captagon Act, right?
Yeah.
Literally, the first thing I searched in Google is that the Captagon Act passed in December 2022. So
Yes,
why?
but it's not being enforced.
Wait, but if it passed, that still means it'll get enforced, right? So how does affirming means it get enforced, right? I'm confused because the act has already been passed. So why does affirming mean you enforce it now?
Because, the act hasn't been passed.
Well, we would dispute that.
Okay, but even if the act has been passed, you need to actually fund and enforce the act. Otherwise, it's just words on paper.
Well, yeah,
right?
but the bill
Because
and
you
the
need to allocate
legislation
but you need to allocate funding to the Captagon Act.
Well, yeah, but that's what the legislation is for. The legislation already says, I can provide you a specific number
Okay,
later,
sure.
that the legislation already tells you how the Captagon Act is going to be funded, which is exactly
Alright,
why
sure.
it got passed.
Okay.
It doesn't make sense that legislation will get passed without any form of funding or
But
any
if you
details.
say we're not in the region, if we're not actually increasing diplomatic presence in the region and we've pulled out, how are we actually going to enforce the Captagon Act if we're not even in the region?
So, but then
it's
we
much
just-
less effective. We're not actually.
All right. Is anybody not ready? Cool. Let's start the time now. Let's start on their first contention about an Iraqi civil war. Let's look at historical precedent first. The U.S. has not stopped any form of civil war or even a conflict. In fact, under U.S. diplomacy, our argument is that under U.S. diplomacy, for example, terrorism globally has after the U.S. has pulled out, terrorism, for example, decreased by 82%. Moreover, let's look at why U.S. diplomacy fails in Iraq. First is because of external factors. What Slim 22 finds is that how much the U.S. interest can even influence the political trajectory in Iraq is uncertain. That's because events are primarily defined by local actors' cost-benefit calculi and are not influenced by outside interventions. What this means is that in Iraq specifically, they are not as much interested in what the US thinks, which is why conflict is going right now. And second is that the government is stubborn. What Garepis 22 finds is that the US may conclude that the Iraqi government inability to make meaningful reforms such that there is little to gain by increased engagement. Our evidence is really clear in saying that engaging more doesn't actually gain anything. In fact, if anything, we would argue that the US media in conflict is specifically worse. That is because the Hoffman evidence indicates that the US commitments in the Middle East yield no benefit because US support allows and emboldens these governments to act with impunity abroad. For example, our Kenwick evidence finds that civil conflicts that end in negotiated settlements featuring third-party interveners like the US are 94% more likely to experience negotiated peace failure. What this means is that when third parties like the US get involved, historically peace has failed. Let's go to their second argument about Syrian drug trafficking. The first thing to note is that this entire argument relies on the passage of this act called the Capricorn Act. But what you have to recognize is that it was able to pass in the House in September. But the important thing to realize is it has not passed fully in the last 6 months. And the reason for that is because it is unpopular politically and is unable to get the political strength. For them to be able to win this round, they need to be able to prove that increased US diplomacy garners the political strength to pass this act in the first place. We would argue that increasing diplomacy by the resolution by no means fundamentally means that the act passes. In fact, their own evidence that talks about US diplomacy solving does not talk about the Capricorn Act specifically. What it just says is that it can, quote, bring over to attention the Syria's Capricorn industry, not that the specific act that they talk about will get passed. Which means that even if you buy their link evidence that's talking about how the US will help in Syria in the Capricorn crisis, that does not mean that the act that they talk about and all the impacts that they talk about actually happen, because there isn't political strength for that. And moreover, we would argue that their evidence would still argue why drug trafficking specifically leads to war. We would argue that the more probable cause of war are things like terrorism that we bring up on our case. In fact, our evidence indicates that nearly 12% of terrorist groups escalate to the use of a civil war because of these different conflicts. That is why, for example, in Syria and other countries like that, terrorism has increased civil wars. Moreover, Syrian drug trafficking has been happening since 2000. It's not like suddenly, as soon as the US pulled out of the Middle East, drug trafficking boomed. Insofar as that's true, affirming and passing the Capricorn Act won't have any tangible impact. In fact, in 2015, when the US was highly involved, you didn't see anything happen here. Make them prove to you that in past instances of increased diplomacy, we've been able to pass bills like this because that isn't what the resolution means. Just by passing this resolution, just by affirming the topic, doesn't mean this act is passed. In fact, what happened in 2015 specifically is that the Senate passed the Transnational Drug Trafficking Act of 2015, yet trafficking didn't decrease. That is why when you pass acts like this, not only do we argue that it isn't probable to pass, but we also think that there isn't a tangible impact historically. That is because there are so many other causes to things like the Capricorn crisis. Think about it logically. Things like the Capricorn crisis are obviously multifaceted issues, as with any drug country. Look at any country that has struggled with drug issues and things like that. It is not a one-solved solution, which is why they aren't able to give historical examples why similar legislation to the Capricorn has been successful. And thus, we're proud to negate.
It's gonna start with an overview. It's kind of a broad response to the military narrative. And then I'll go into responding to their specific arguments against our case, then I'll go into responding to their case. Is everybody ready? Okay. A lot of the problems they've brought forth in the round are due to the United States' actions in the past. Biden's pullout from Afghanistan in 2022 has marked a fundamental shift in the United States' policy. Catullus 22 tells you that the new approach is more cautious than the previous administration's efforts in the Middle East. The United States has sought to put diplomacy first. While an important first step, increased diplomacy is still required for issues. Indeed, Morgan 22 cites that the U.S. should revitalize its diplomatic engagement with Arab and Israeli partners. Moreover, the United States' pullout and Biden's commitment to end forever wars means that the problems of the past are not the reality of the present. That's going to be crucial as we go on throughout the round. I'll be implicating it as we go. Starting on our first contention about the Iraqi Civil War. The first thing they tell you is that there's no historical precedent of us solving conflicts. That's because in the past we've put military first. Yes, we'll acknowledge that the United States may have done terrible things in the past, but that United States is not the same one of the present. But then secondly, their evidence that they sent us is absolutely misconstrued. They're literally, if you read the tagline of the evidence, it's saying that the U.S. should engage in Iraq. Then they tell you that terror has decreased, or that they talk about this terrorism argument. I'll talk about them more in their case. Then, the next argument they make is that that engaging more doesn't do anything. While in the past that may have been true, our evidence from Wahab and PFAC are very explicit in telling you that diplomacy is needed in the Iraqi civil war in order to prevent a civil war that will kill hundreds of thousands of people. The last thing they tell you is that U.S. agreements fail 94% of the time. Their argument and their evidence is all about the military. It has nothing to do with peaceful diplomacy. Remember the resolution. It's talking about the United States peacefully resolving conflicts. A lot of their arguments are due to military interaction, which are inherently not peaceful and are not relevant in this debate. Let's go to our second contention about the Syrian drug crisis. The first thing they tell you is that Captagon wasn't actually passed and that we need political support. However, if the United States affirms and if we increase our diplomatic efforts, in order to pass the Captagon Act, it will become absolutely vital, which is why we will get political support. Then they tell you that our evidence doesn't name it. It absolutely does. The next argument they make is that there's no evidence why drugs lead to war. That fundamentally misunderstands the argument. It's not that drugs lead to war, it's that the war right now is being fueled because Assad is getting money from the drugs, thus cutting off his wealth, cuts off the war. The next response that they read you about trafficking not going down and this one-size-fits-all thing aren't really relevant in the debate. That's because in their world, there's a 100% probability that the Syrian war continues. In our world, even if there's a fractional chance that this Captagon Act worked, we tell you still affirm because there's a chance that you save hundreds of thousands of lives. It's better to try than die. Let's go to their specific arguments. On the top, they're telling you that China's good. That's fundamentally false. Allowing China to take over the region would destabilize it, as Catullus finds that reducing America's role in the region would lead to increased engagement by China, which would further weaken the structural foundations of the region. Secondly, even if their argument is true, they haven't given you a single warrant or explanation why the United States and China can't exist peacefully together and do diplomacy together. We can get the best of both worlds. Lastly, on China, the argument they make about South Sudan is absolutely not relevant in this debate because it's about African engagement. Also, it has nothing to do, there's no track record of China in the Middle East. Also, China is a fundamentally authoritarian country, which means that we would argue that their diplomacy and engagement leads to more authoritarianism in the Middle East. Then in their argument about terrorism, there's a bunch of problems. First, they're arguing about terrorists because of drone strikes and violent intervention. Again, the United States will be peacefully involved. Secondly, the only way to solve for terrorism is through diplomacy. Indeed, Culbertson 22 explains that preventing terrorism will require diplomacy. Thus, we actually can co-opt all of their impacts with these terrorism negative impacts because the only way we actually solve for terrorism is in the Af world. Lastly, we would argue that even if you don't believe either of those two things, terrorists would have likely gone to power either way because they would have scapegoated something else. For all of these reasons, Daniel and I are proud to affirm. Are you ready for cross? Would you like the first question?
Of course. All right. Let's start the time now. So can you give me an example of any bill similar to the Captagon bill in terms of increased diplomacy that has gone past, like simply as a result of our diplomatic engagement?
I can't give you one off the top of my head, but just because something hasn't happened in the past doesn't mean that it can in the future. The Af world is a brand new world. Can I take a question?
No, but I don't think it's a brand new world, right? Because we've had increased military,
Yes,
military.
that's the exact
diplomatic argument.
what you just said is exactly true. In the past, the United States has been military engaged, which is
diplomatically.
No. Well, first of all, that our evidence is very explicit. We can send it to you if you'd like. But the United States in the past has prioritized military intervention over diplomacy. The pullout of Afghanistan, however, has simple to shift. May I take a question?
Sure, for sure.
Okay. What religion it primarily makes up the Middle East?
You want to tell me?
Well, it's 93%. It's 93% of the Middle East. What is currently happening to Muslims in China?
Okay, so you're going to tell me how there's obviously that China's mistreating their Uyghur Muslims.
Yes.
But our argument is that doesn't have to, China's diplomacy in the Middle East isn't doing authoritarianism or anything like that. In fact,
really?
Yeah, it isn't.
So they're going to somehow, when they've been subjugating this specific population in their internal country, suddenly when they go to the Middle East, they're going to stop subjugating them?
So
is there an explanation why?
Yeah, for sure. So what our evidence is really clear in saying is that the thesis of China's policy in the Middle East is non-interference. That is the most important thing.
Sure.
Right? Can I finish my answer? So my point is that When the US gets involved, what our Reagan evidence indicates is that the US tries to get involved within these countries' political processes. That is the issue, and that is why countries have already turned to China because of non-interference. So just because China abuses the Uyghur Muslims at home doesn't mean that they spread that abroad, and there's no empirics
on that. Can I take a follow-up question?
For sure.
So if China's not going to get involved in the political climates of these countries, how exactly is it going to solve exactly is it going to solve conflicts?
Of course. So their goal isn't to promote influence. Their goal is peace mediation, which, for example, they've done in South Sudan. We'll talk about.
But doesn't that inherently mean getting involved in the political process? Because the people who are causing conflict and who would come to the peace table would be political parties.
Our argument is that we're talking specifically about like the type of policies that are being passed, right? Our point is that they talk to peace negotiations that is completely different than trying to put China's values and China's own values and whatnot and what they do into the policy.
If I'm racist here, that doesn't mean that I stop being racist.
Well, that's our argument is that that's the thesis of China's policy, right? That's why historically countries have already turned to China, right? For example, Syria.
Okay, they've been in the region. Has anything positive happened specifically in the Middle East?
Absolutely. Well, the most important evidence, yeah, for sure. The most important evidence that you absolutely don't respond to is that in the last 4 years, the amount of conflict-related deaths in the region has gone by 75%. That is super clear in telling you that after China's increased engagement, conflict-related deaths
correlation is not causation.
Okay, sure.
In total, we've used 1 minute.
Yeah, how much total?
We've used 1 minute 48 seconds, right?
Okay.
Order in this speech will just be our case and then my opponent's case. Is anyone not ready? Go. Judges, this round is getting a little messy. Let me clean it up for you. Our sole argument revolves around Middle Eastern relations. Over the past few years, the US has been infamous for throwing its allies under the bus, proven when the US shrugged off Iran and Saudi Arabia. Additionally, the US has tried to control the country's politics, often angering domestic citizens, and was the #1 reason behind the 1900% spike in terrorism. This is where China enters the play. China's unique approach of non-interference has been appealing to these countries, especially given their successful track record from Sudan to Syria. And we have seen West Asian terrorism decrease by 82% and reach an all-time low because of this approach. Additionally, war deaths have also decreased by 75%. As such, affirming that the US re-engaging is unnecessary and a recipe for disaster. Beyond increasing terrorism, they will directly confront China, which will most definitely cause unneeded conflict in a currently peaceful region. They give you a couple of responses. Let's address this. On this overview that Biden is different from past American approaches, let me read to you the first line of our case. Professor Michael Rubin tells you that Biden's mantra might be diplomacy is back after pulling out of Afghanistan, but throwing allies under the bus has always been his doctrine because of his short-sighted attacks and his unwillingness to address the Iran nuclear deal or take the Saudi strategy concerns seriously. The US has always been negatively involved in the Middle East for decades at a time, while the Middle East just sounds be like, okay, the US is our friend. That's not how it works. That is exactly why the professor concludes that the trust Biden lost with Saudi Arabia will take decades to rebuild. It's not a 1 minute affirming solve of the issue. Then they say that China is bad because it increases authoritarianism. They have conceded all of the warranting from our case, where we tell you that China is a non-interference strategy. China sends diplomats, not military and political interference like the US does. Moreover, they have conceded that change has already occurred when the China has been there. Then they say that the South Sudan empiric is invalid and that China isn't involved in the Middle East. That's ridiculous. South Sudan is an example of how China has been successful in the past. If anything, the affirmative has not given a single empiric of any conflict or civil war the US has solved. They have also conceded that Middle Eastern countries are already turning to China. Then they give a bunch of terror responses, group all of them. They have conceded a game-changing evidence that terrorism has decreased by 82%, conflict deaths have gone down by 75%. Finally, they say that US and China can coexist. The real world doesn't work like this. Political scientists tell you that China's rising role in the region means it has to mediate conflicts, but the US has to go outside, otherwise that will lead to confrontation and collusion. Let's talk about Iraq. They don't respond to the fact that US interests can influence the political trajectory on the ground in Iraq, and it's uncertain, and events are primarily defined by local actors' cost benefit. Then they also concede that diplomacy worsens conflict because the US support emboldens these governments. On Syrian drug trafficking, we tell you that the Captagon crisis has so many alt causes, and that there's so many alt crises, just affirming won't solve the issue. Thus, Nikki.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Is everyone ready? I'm going to begin by just discussing like some kind of overall overview type arguments, and then I'll go on to their contention, and then I'll go on to ours. Is everybody ready?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
What was the order? What flow first?
Oh yeah. So first, I'll just be doing like overview. Well, I just do their case, our case.
Okay, so.
Yeah. For flow, I'll do their case, our case. For the other judges, I'll be doing just overall stuff, then talking about their case about relations, and then our arguments. Everyone ready? All right. To begin, they are throwing numbers at you. We understand. But let me explain why these numbers are correlation and not causation. The first large number they give you is that terrorism and conflict has decreased. When we look at where their number actually comes from, it starts in 2017. Remember, as Yash says, the US diplomatic disengagement or military disengagement began in 2021 when the US pulled out of Afghanistan, not 2017. If terror has been decreasing since 2017, clearly there are alternative causes, such as the other causes in the region. The United States is currently not involved militarily and will not be into the future, and Biden has reaffirmed this. You need to make sure that all of their impacts are specifically about the United States diplomatically, not about the United States militarily, and not correlation and not causation. Now on to their first contention about relations. They dispute the fact that the US approach is more cautious because they say it's bad for their allies. They're conceding that it's bad for the United States to move away from terrible actors such as Saudi Arabia for their human rights violations, while at the same time saying that non-biased mediation in the form of China is good. If anything, if they're correct, we shouldn't be having strong allies in the region. We should be doing what China does, which is not engaging whatsoever. But this just isn't true, because China not engaging whatsoever means they can't actually make any peace. He struggles to explain any actual concrete things or actions China has done in the region. The United States has done many concrete actions, including helping the UN broker peace in Yemen, as well as other areas. They say we're throwing allies under the bus and get too involved, but then China doesn't get involved at all, because how are you supposed to do diplomacy without actually getting involved in the political regions? They talk about terrorism, but they concede the evidence that terrorism is decreased by diplomacy. That's the Catullus evidence. And also, it claims that the new approach in Afghanistan is different from previous administrations' efforts. Again, on China, how on earth is China going to solve conflicts in the region when at home they're discriminating against the Uyghur Muslims, and Muslims are the main majority in the Middle East? You don't just leave your racism at home. China's racism and hatred towards Muslims is going to hamper its efforts in the Middle East, because it doesn't just end at home. They also haven't explained to us how China and the US are actual zero-sum game. They talk about what political scientists say, but they don't actually explain to you why the US and China can both coexist in the region. They say that US countries are already turning to China. Yeah, they're turning to China at the same time as the US. That's how things work normally. Now in Iraq, they give you barely any responses to it. They only say that the events are primarily affected by actors at home. I mean, yes, events are primarily affected by actors in Iraq, but the United States can do all they can and try or die to solve the conflict. On Captagon, they only claim the one thing they say is that there are alternative causes. Again, on Iraq, we are the only ones with a risk of solvency because we are negotiating an end to the possible civil war. The United States is the only one who can actually do this because we have stake in the game, because we have allies in the region. And this would save 300,000 people from an Iraqi civil war. And on drugs, Captagon, we're stopping the drug trade, we're stopping the war in Syria. 300,000 lives saved.
Alright, we're ready for cross.
Okay, cool. Can we take the first question?
Sure.
Cool. So let's start time now.
Sure.
So you tell me that so let's talk about your argument on Syrian drug trafficking, right?
Yeah.
So can you explain again how affirming leads to political strength for this bill?
Yeah, I'd love to. So Syria is the largest internal armed conflict in West Asia by a mile. There's already been 300,000 people dead. If we're going to look to peacefully resolve armed conflicts in West Asia, the Syrian conflict is the number one conflict we're going to focus on.
Wait, but
how is the best? May I finish responding? What is the best way to stop a terrible actor from continuing the fighting? Cut off their finances. Without finances, Syria can't actually buy any weapons.
So
Let me finish. because this would be the best way to cut off Syria, and therefore the best way to solve the armed conflict. This would likely, increasing diplomacy would very likely lead to something
Okay,
like
so
Captain
let me ask you a
America
quick follow-up. So in September of this year, it only got passed in the House, right? Why isn't it getting passed in the Senate right now? Because all of your evidence about how like the Syrian issue is really bad is happening right now.
Yeah.
But however, after it passed in the House, it has not passed in the Senate, right? If it like this is all true right now, right? So
You're just
theoretically
making an
it should have
argument.
passed.
Can we respond to your question?
Like I don't understand
Can we
how
respond
like
to
the
your-
House.
you're just
Okay,
making
okay.
an
So my
argument.
question
Maybe
is like here's my question, right? How does affirming somehow generate like within Republicans and
Because it
Democrats in the
generates
Senate?
urgency.
How does it get like Republicans
Because-
and Democrats in the Senate to change their
Right,
ideology?
may we
right
respond,
now?
please?
Okay.
May we respond, please?
When you affirm and you try to get involved in these internal armed conflicts, we're going to quickly see that the best way to resolve the Syrian conflict is through passing the Captain Act. That's why under the AFROM there's a unique urgency to end the war because we're trying to resolve these conflicts. Thus there's also a unique urgency to pass the act. May we please take a question? It's been like 2 minutes.
Sure.
Okay, let's talk about all of these statistics that you have thrown at us.
Of course.
Does a single one of them link a causal link between the statistic in China?
So we actually explained many different wars.
Just
okay,
that was
first
a
of
yes
all-
or no question.
No, it doesn't. It
Okay.
doesn't. But if
You
you
can have
allow
a
me to
question.
explain, I think you've given a lot of explanation. I'd love to.
I don't need an explanation.
I think I should
No,
get the
no.
chance to explain it. But yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Sure. So our argument and the warrants that we give you from multiple pieces of evidence, such as Hubbard, indicate that China has a unique policy of non-interference. If you want specific causal evidence, we use South Sudan example, where specifically our evidence is hyper-specific that it was China and that it was Chinese mediators that were crucial to engaging the ceasefire. And you say that it might not be causal, but fundamentally we engage the warranting, and also like empirically the status quo is working in our argument.
Alright, so may I have a question? So is China the only neutral mediator that exists?
Well, it's the one that currently Middle Eastern countries are going towards.
Okay, you just told us that you don't have any causal evidence.
No,
That
no,
means
wait,
that the
wait.
80% decrease in terrorism and the 70% decrease in
No,
conflict
no, no,
deaths,
no.
you have, listen, you can tell us that China is a brilliant mediator. They can be the best
I mean,
mediator in the world.
We read all of these
Wait,
warrants,
can I
though.
finish?
Like that's a
Can I
big
finish?
right? We read
No,
multiple
hold on,
warrants.
hold on.
Warrants.
Can I please
I mean, we
finish
read
asking?
evidence that's
Please,
working,
can I
right? Just
finish
because
responding?
we don't have one card that makes that
Please,
same link.
okay.
That's time.
Alright.
Okay. We'll take our remaining 1 minute and 12 seconds. Sorry. Okay. The order is going to be starting on their case and then going to our case. Okay. Is anybody not ready?
No.
Cool.
Oh, no.
Oh, my bad. Yeah. Okay.
I am now.
Okay, cool. If everyone's ready, let's start the time now. Let's go to the first contention on Iraq. They don't respond to our turn in any speech. Don't let them do it in final focus. We say that diplomacy worsens conflict after the conceded Hoffman evidence that finds that U.S. and the commitments in the Middle East yields no benefits because U.S. supports allows and emboldens these governments to act with impunity abroad, which creates a moral hazard. That is unresponded to and is by far the easiest place to vote, which means that if you want to link into their impact on Iraq civil war, starting hundreds of thousands of lives, you vote for us because increased diplomacy worsens conflict. Another second argument, remember that first of all, they do not give you a single explanation in the round as to how you get this political strength. Remember, it is already passed in the House. There's a reason why it hasn't passed in the Senate. It's because of lack of political strength. They just vaguely assert diplomacy equals political strength. That is not true. They also concede there's tons of different causes for the Capricorn crisis, and even if the Capricorn Act passed, it does not solve for this. Their impacts are very not contextualized, nor do they really extend a link or explain their argument more in their summary speech. You should not be considered voting here. Our argument, however, on the other hand, is by far the most contextualized and well-explained argument in the round. What they don't respond to in their last speech is that over the past few years, the U.S. has been infamous for throwing its allies under the bus, proving the U.S. shrugged off Iran and Saudi Arabia. Why is this important? Well, what it means is that even if the U.S. wants to get re-engaged diplomatically, the Middle Eastern countries do not trust the U.S., which is why right now they've turned to China. It does not matter if the U.S. tries to re-engage diplomatically, if countries like their own example of Syria do not trust the U.S. In fact, the reason is because the U.S. tried to control these countries' policies. They say that China is a bad actor through discrimination, but since 2013, when China got involved, we have not seen any form of discrimination. Remember, China's unique policy is through non-interference, right? Just because they are racist in their country doesn't mean they push it in the Middle East, which is historically in countries like South Sudan, and in fact recently Syria, their own country, has now turned to China. That is why our evidence indicates that war deaths have decreased by 75%. They say we aren't able to establish a causal link. No, we read you the multiple warrants as to how China is able to do non-interference and diplomatically engage in these countries most successfully. And moreover, we saw that terrorism decreased by 82% because you don't have the US who tries to control these countries' policies and lower their political upspeed. Thus, we urge you to the evil.
Okay, in terms of the order, it's going to follow Daniel's speech. So it'll be briefly on the overview about the United States' posture globally, their argument about relations in China, then our argument about Iraq, and if I have time, I'll get to argument about drugs, or drug trafficking. Is everybody right? Time starts. The overview hasn't ever been properly interacted with. Remember that the United States of today is not the United States of the past. The examples and things they talk about of all the problems have all to do with the United States military engaging in the Middle East. That's not the case anymore. We're a peaceful negotiation. Remember the conflict. It's talking about peaceful intervention. With that being said, let's go to their contention. They read you all of the warrants in the world why China is a brilliant mediator. None of that matters at the point that all of these statistics they read you, just like they conceded in Grand Crossfire, do not link these decrease to China. Just because China was in the region at the same time that it decreased doesn't mean that it happened. I wore this tie today and we won 2 debate rounds. That doesn't mean that we won 2 debate rounds because I wore this tie. Also, they've conceded the fact that China's non-interventionism precludes them from being actually effective in the region. That's because China is so non-interventionist that they'll never get involved in conflicts and they'll never solve anything. Also, they've not really properly addressed the fact that China is racist towards Muslims in their own country. Again, just because you're racist here doesn't mean that you stop being racist when you go over here. Their internal bias and ideology will take them wherever they go, which if anything will make any conflicts far worse. Lastly, that's why all of their examples are from Sudan and non-Muslim areas. That's why they haven't done anything positive in the Middle East. Also, their thing about Syria is late. Also, they were supporting a bad group. Let's go to Iraq. Their turn was responded to. We told you that everything bad that has happened in Iraq is because of the military. That's the nuance they've never once touched in the ground. Remember that in the Ned world, we're headed towards a civil war that will kill hundreds of thousands of people. So even if there's a chance that in the AFRO diplomacy will resolve this conflict, you must affirm. That's because the world, there's a 100% chance of a conflict with hundreds of thousands of people dying. However, in the AFRO, even if there's a fraction of a chance that we can save these lives, you must affirm. Lastly, on drugs, remember there's no alternative causes, and again, the same thing. The Syrian civil war will continue regardless in the neg world. The only way to even have a chance at stopping it is to affirm. Daniel and I are very proud.
Great round, everyone.
Great round, everyone.
Good job, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Good job, guys. Well done.
Well done.
Congrats.